I've always been drawn to the outdoors. Something about the vastness of the forests, the hum of wind through trees, and the rhythmic sound of footsteps on dirt paths made me feel grounded. There's a kind of peace to it, a kind of stillness you can't get anywhere else. So when I found myself with a few days off from work, I figured a solo hike would be the perfect way to clear my mind. I had done this plenty of times before. I wasn't an expert by any means, but I was experienced enough to know how to prepare for a hike. I knew to bring plenty of water, some snacks, a compass, and a map. I checked the weather forecast, clear skies, mild temperatures. Perfect conditions for a long hike in the mountains. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-morning, the sun already high but not yet too hot. There was a light breeze, and the air smelled fresh, like pine needles and damp earth. I packed my gear and set off, looking forward to the solitude. There weren't many other people around, just a couple of cars in the parking lot when I pulled in, but they were already gone by the time I hit the trail. The first part of the hike was easy. The path wound gently through the forest, dappled sunlight streaming through the leaves overhead. Birds chirped from the trees, and every so often, a squirrel would dart across the trail, its tail flicking like a tiny whip. I passed a small stream, its water crystal clear, gurgling over rocks. It was the kind of scenery that made you stop and appreciate the quiet moments. I kept walking, the ground beneath my boots soft and uneven. The path slowly began to climb. My heart rate picked up a little, but nothing I couldn't handle. I had done this before, I reminded myself. I was in good shape, and this wasn't a particularly tough trail. Still, I appreciated the challenge of the climb. It was a good test for my stamina. As I hiked, I thought about life back home, work, bills, all the usual things that seem to occupy my mind too much lately. Out here, though, I felt a kind of relief. The forest had a way of shutting out the noise. I could focus on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, listening to the rhythm of my breathing, feeling the burn in my legs as I pushed myself upward. Hours passed. The trail got steeper, and the trees started to thin out. The air felt cooler, and I noticed the scent of damp moss starting to take over. I was nearing the higher elevations now. The sound of the stream was far behind me, replaced by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The trail leveled off for a bit, and I took the opportunity to stop and catch my breath. I drank some water and ate a granola bar. I looked around, taking in the view. The mountains loomed around me, their peaks dusted with snow even though it was spring. The valleys below were dotted with patches of forest, and I could see the river winding through the distance, a silver thread cutting through the landscape. It was during this brief rest that I noticed something odd. There was a sound, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a rustling, like someone or something moving through the brush nearby. I scanned the area, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The trees were sparse here, and the underbrush wasn't thick. Whatever it was far off. I shrugged it off. Probably an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer or a bear. I'd seen plenty of signs of wildlife on previous hikes. Tracks, scat, even the occasional distant glimpse of a bear lumbering through the woods. It wasn't uncommon. I stood up and resumed walking. The rustling noise didn't follow me, at least not that I could tell. It felt like I was alone again, and for a while, the hike returned to its usual rhythm. I didn't see another soul for the next couple of hours. The trail became rockier, and the climb more intense. I began to feel the burn in my calves, but it was the kind of pain I welcomed. The kind of pain that told me I was pushing myself. I focused on the trail in front of me, the rocks that jutted out at odd angles, the patches of dirt that were slick with moisture from last night's rain. By the time I reached the summit, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I stood on top of the mountain, looking out over the valley. The view was breathtaking. I felt a sense of accomplishment, like I had just earned this moment of peace. But then, I noticed something strange again. There was a figure. Far below me, across the valley, there was a person on the trail. It was hard to make out any details at that distance, but it was definitely someone hiking. They seemed to be moving fast, almost like they were rushing. I didn't think much of it at first. I was still catching my breath and taking in the view. But then I noticed something unsettling. The person wasn't following the trail. They were moving off the path into the brush, like they were cutting across the wilderness without any clear direction. At first, I figured they were just a hiker who knew the area well. Maybe they were looking for a shortcut or a hidden spot, but there was something off about it. There was no visible backpack, no gear. It was almost like they were moving without any purpose. I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure. I was supposed to be here alone, and it was starting to feel like something wasn't quite right. The thought lingered in the back of my mind as I began my descent, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky as I made my way down the mountain. The temperature dropped a little, and the shadows lengthened across the rocky path. I kept an eye on the trail, making sure not to trip over any loose rocks or uneven ground. I was tired, and I didn't want to make any mistakes now. That's when I heard it again, the rustling sound. It was closer this time, but not close enough for me to see what was causing it. My heart rate picked up. I glanced around quickly, but the trail was empty. No one was there. I kept moving, my steps now more cautious. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I stopped. I had to. The figure from earlier was standing right there, not far from the path, just off to the side. They were watching me. For a moment, I froze. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced with questions. What was this person doing here? Why had they been watching me? There was something unsettling about their stillness. They weren't moving, just standing there, a shadow in the fading light. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I could turn around. I could walk back up the trail, but that would feel like running, and I didn't want to look like I was scared. So instead, I kept walking forward, slowly but steadily. When I got closer, the figure finally moved. They stepped back into the trees, disappearing from view. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I didn't know who this person was or what their intentions were, but the feeling in my gut told me this wasn't normal. I didn't wait to find out what they were going to do. I picked up my pace, not quite running, but walking quickly. The trail felt longer on the way down. My legs were sore, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I would hear a branch snap or the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I moved faster, my breath coming in sharp bursts as I quickened my pace. The sun was almost gone now, and the forest was growing dark. I needed to get to the car. I needed to get out of here. Finally, I reached the parking lot. The car was still there, the only one in the lot. I didn't care. I didn't care that it was late or that I was tired. I got in, slammed the door, and locked it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was no one in the parking lot, no sign of the figure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made it home safe, but every time I go back to the mountains, I can't help but feel like someone is watching me, and I'll never forget the feeling of being alone on that trail until I wasn't anymore. I had always been drawn to hiking, the kind of solitude it offers, the quiet moments in nature, where everything around you feels so vast, so unrelenting. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, something to clear my mind and get away from the usual grind of work and city life. I decided to head to the mountains, a popular hiking trail that I'd heard about from a friend. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another day in the woods, just another trail to explore. I had packed the essentials: water, snacks, a map, and my phone, just in case. I set out early in the morning, hoping to finish the hike before dark. The trail wasn't long, but it was known for its steep inclines and winding paths, making it a bit of a challenge. I was ready for it. I had been on plenty of trails before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the air felt in the early morning, thick and cool, or the way the trees stood so tall, blocking out much of the sunlight. First, it was peaceful. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt path, the distant rustle of wind through the leaves, and the occasional bird call. I was already a few miles in when I noticed something odd. The trail markers were inconsistent. Some were clear, well-placed, while others were worn down, barely visible. I shrugged it off, no big deal, right? Maybe I had missed a turn somewhere, or perhaps they were just faded from the weather. I kept moving forward, my footsteps steady and rhythmic. The trail began to climb, the incline becoming steeper, the trees growing thicker around me. As I pushed on, I noticed how quiet everything had become. The usual buzz of insects, the calls of birds, even the wind seemed to have died down. It was unnerving. I stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat off my brow, looking around. The path ahead was narrow, flanked by dense undergrowth. There were no other hikers in sight. I thought about turning back for a second, but I didn't want to waste the trip. I had come this far, so I pressed on, hoping that the trail would eventually open up again, lead me to something familiar. It wasn't long before I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. I had passed a large, flat rock on my left, something I had remembered from the map, but when I looked back, it was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had missed it, but after a few more steps, I realized that the trail ahead didn't look right. The path had become increasingly overgrown, with thick brambles and vines creeping in from the sides. It felt like I was being swallowed by the woods. I stopped again, this time taking out my map. I traced my finger along the route, trying to make sense of it. According to the map, the trail should have been turning left soon, but all I saw was more dense forest. My gut told me something was off, but I tried to stay calm. I knew I had been on trails before where the markings were hard to follow, where you had to make decisions based on the land itself, not just the signs. I decided to keep going, hoping to see the next marker or perhaps an intersection where I could make sense of where I was. But the longer I walked, the stranger things got. The trees seemed to close in around me more tightly, and the air felt heavier, like the weight of the forest itself was pressing down on me. After a few more miles, I came across something that made my heart race. It was a footprint, a large, deep print in the dirt. It wasn't human, at least not the way a human footprint should look. The shape was too wide, the depth too uneven, like it had been made by something much larger than a person. I squatted down, examining it closely, my heart pounding. I'd read about mountain lions and bears in the area, but this didn't feel right. The print didn't look fresh, but it was large enough to make me nervous. I stood up quickly, my thoughts spinning. I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. I checked my surroundings, the trees, the brush, the sky. Nothing. Everything seemed still, too still. By now, the sun had started to dip lower, and the shadows of the trees grew longer. I had to keep moving if I wanted to make it out of the woods before dark. But as I walked, the path seemed to change again. The familiar trail markers were now gone, replaced by nothing but tangled branches and rocky outcrops. It was as if the trail itself was leading me deeper into the wilderness, farther from the safety of the park entrance. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just a trail. There was nothing to worry about, I told myself. I had been on harder trails, more dangerous terrain. But the unease in my stomach grew stronger with every step. And then I heard it, a rustle, a snap of a twig. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My eyes darted around, scanning the trees, the underbrush. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a flash of fur maybe, but when I looked again, there was nothing. My heart was in my throat, my breath shallow. I kept moving, faster now, trying not to panic. The last thing I wanted was to be caught out here at night, alone with who knows what in these woods. But the more I walked, the more the sense of being followed crept up on me. I wasn't just hearing things. Something was moving in the woods. I stopped again, trying to pinpoint the sound. There it was again, closer this time. A low growl, like something was getting ready to pounce. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever it was, but I couldn't just stand there either. I grabbed a large stick from the ground, holding it in front of me like some kind of makeshift weapon. The growl came again, but this time I recognized it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was something else entirely. Something large, but not so much an animal as it was something that was moving through the woods, pacing me, staying just out of sight. The sounds of its movements were deliberate, each step coming at regular intervals, like it was toying with me, watching my every move. I broke into a sprint, adrenaline surging through my veins. Every step felt like it might be my last. I didn't know where the trail was anymore. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever was following me. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs aching, until I stumbled into a clearing. For the first time since I'd started, I saw a sign. It was the trail marker I had missed earlier. I could see the entrance to the park, far in the distance, and with it the faintest glimmer of safety. I made it to the edge of the clearing, gasping for breath, the weight of everything finally crashing down on me. It wasn't just fear I had felt, but the very real sensation that something had been out there, hunting me. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. The drive back was a blur, the mountains growing smaller in my rearview mirror as I left the forest behind. The air in my lungs finally felt normal again, but the lingering sense that I had narrowly escaped something terrifying would never leave me. I don't know what was out there that day, but I never went back to that trail again, and I never will. I've always been one for the outdoors. Growing up in the mountains, hiking was almost a daily ritual. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a way of life. My father taught me how to navigate through trails, read the sky for weather, and respect nature. I felt at peace there, in the forest, away from the noise of civilization. It was my sanctuary, but this time felt different. I wasn't hiking with friends or family. I was alone. Maybe that was the problem, or maybe it was the time of year. Early autumn. The trees had started to turn, their colors bright and vibrant, but the wind carried a crisp bite, and the air smelled of coming rain. Not the usual scent of fresh pine, but something more sinister, as if the earth itself was preparing for something. The trail I decided to take was one I had been on before. It was a relatively easy hike, or so I thought. The path wound its way through dense woods, past a creek, and up toward a small ridge where a view of the valley awaited. I had done it dozens of times, but for some reason, the weight of the solitude pressed heavier on me today. Maybe it was the silence that surrounded me, or the odd way the clouds gathered in the sky. I checked my gear, made sure everything was in place. My backpack was light, just the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone, though I had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. The trail ahead looked clear, with a few leaves scattered along the ground, but otherwise, everything was calm. Too calm. The path began to climb, and as I walked, I felt a deep sense of isolation. The trees, thick with their autumn coats, created a canopy overhead, blocking out most of the daylight. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, the noise of the outside world fading into the distance. Only the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and occasional bird call filled the air. It was strange, though. As the day wore on, I began to notice things. A branch that snapped loudly in the distance. The rustle of leaves that didn't seem to come from the wind. I stopped a few times, scanning the area, but saw nothing. Just the quiet, eerie stillness of the woods. I kept walking, pushing through the growing discomfort. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It wasn't unusual for animals to be around, and even the wind had a way of making the forest sound strange, especially with no one else around. After a few hours, I reached the ridge I'd been aiming for. The view was breathtaking, as always. The valley stretched out below me, the faint outline of a distant mountain range visible in the distance. The air was cool, and the silence on top of the ridge was almost deafening. I took a few minutes to catch my breath, pulling out my water bottle and taking a sip, letting the cool liquid settle in my stomach. I stood there for a while, just staring out at the view. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, though. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest had a way of feeling alive, but today it felt watchful, as if something was waiting. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I turned around and began making my way back down the ridge, following the path I had taken earlier. It wasn't long before the sense of unease returned, stronger now. The The sounds I had noticed earlier seemed closer, more distinct. The snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves. I paused again, heart pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I looked around, but again, saw nothing. The trail had started to get steeper, and I focused on my footing, trying to push away the feeling that I was being followed. But that's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping underfoot. This time it was closer. I froze, scanning the trees, my pulse quickening. Still nothing. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anyone. I kept walking, quicker now, the thought of being alone in these woods making me uneasy. The path was narrow, winding through dense underbrush. I could feel the eyes of the forest on me, or at least that's what it felt like. The sound of footsteps following mine, of the crunching leaves, the distant calls of birds. It all seemed too much. I checked the time on my phone, 4:30 p.m. It would be dark soon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the mountains. I wasn't far from the trailhead, but the thought of staying in the woods after nightfall felt wrong. Something about the place today felt different, like I wasn't supposed to be there. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement through the trees, too fast to be a deer or a bear. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the spot where it had been. It was just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to make my heart race. I started walking faster, not looking back. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders. Every step I took, every rustle of leaves, felt like someone or something was getting closer. I didn't dare turn around to look. I just kept moving. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again. This time it was closer, much closer. It was a figure, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, blending with the shadows of the trees. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but as I blinked, the figure was still there, moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. I broke into a run. My feet pounded against the dirt, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know who or what it was, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The trail twisted and turned, but all I could think about was getting out of the woods, getting back to safety. The sky was darkening quickly. I could barely make out the trail in front of me, the shadows growing longer and deeper. The rustling in the trees behind me had stopped, but the sound of my own panicked breathing was deafening. I don't know how long I ran, maybe a few minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually I reached the trailhead. The parking lot, empty when I arrived, was now full of parked cars. I didn't care about the people. I just needed to get in my car and leave. I didn't look back as I got in the car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still racing. I started the engine, my foot slamming on the gas as I drove out of the parking lot, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the mountain ridges, casting an orange glow across the dense forest. The air was crisp, with a slight breeze rustling through the branches. I had been hiking for hours, the only sounds around me being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call in the distance. The path was narrow, barely a trail in some places, and I was starting to feel the fatigue in my legs. But it wasn't just the physical strain that had me on edge. It was something else. The forest was eerily quiet, almost unnervingly so. I'd expected more wildlife sounds, but all I heard was the wind. The lack of birds chirping, the absence of squirrels and rustling in the underbrush made the woods feel off. I wasn't the kind of person who usually got spooked, especially not by a little solitude. But today was different. I had hiked these trails before, months ago when the weather was warmer, but I'd always done it with a group. This time I was alone, and that felt odd. I wasn't sure why, but it did. Maybe it was because the woods felt thicker, the shadows deeper than I remembered. Or maybe it was just the strange quietness around me. I pressed on, telling myself to ignore it. After all, I had a goal in mind, reaching the summit by nightfall. I didn't want to be out here longer than necessary. I glanced down at my phone, checking the time. 5:45 p.m. If I didn't make it soon, it would be too dark to find my way back. The forest could be deceptive at night. I could get lost easily, and I had no intention of spending a night out here, alone in the middle of nowhere. The path started to get steeper, and the trees began to thin out, giving way to more rocky terrain. I felt my legs aching, but I pushed through, telling myself it would be worth it once I got to the top. The view from the summit was always breathtaking. The last stretch of the trail was uphill, the rocks jagged and uneven, making it hard to keep a steady pace. I was nearing the top when I noticed something strange, a faint smell in the air. It wasn't like anything I had ever smelled in the forest before. It was sharp, almost metallic, with a hint of something rotten. I stopped in my tracks, my senses suddenly alert. I had no idea what it was, but something about the smell didn't sit right with me. I scanned the trees around me, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No movement, nothing. The smell lingered, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I quickly dismissed the thought. It was probably just some decaying animal carcass or something I could ignore. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and kept climbing. At the top, I took a moment to catch my breath, leaning against a large rock. The view was as beautiful as I remembered. Sprawling valleys, distant mountains fading into the horizon, and the sun just beginning to dip below the sky. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long sip, trying to shake off the unease I'd felt earlier. But as I stood there, admiring the view, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement in the trees, far below me, just at the edge of the forest. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but there was something odd about the way it moved. Jerky, unnatural. I squinted, trying to make it out, but whatever it was too far away to identify clearly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence around me had returned, and it was suffocating. I turned back toward the direction I had come from, trying to brush off the unsettling sensation creeping up my spine. I knew I needed to head back. The sun was dipping lower, and the forest would be much harder to navigate in the dark. But as I started down the trail, I noticed something else. Footprints. Fresh ones. They weren't animal tracks. The prints were too deep, too defined, and they looked human. My stomach turned. I wasn't the only one up here. I followed the prints for a while, my footsteps growing heavier as the trail grew steeper. They led me deeper into the forest, back toward where I had first noticed the flicker of movement. I cursed under my breath, realizing how stupid this was. I shouldn't have followed the tracks, but something inside me, the same thing that had kept me moving despite the rising fear, compelled me to. Maybe I could get close enough to see who else was out here. Maybe I could figure out if it was someone like me, just another hiker, or if it was something else entirely. I kept going. The tracks seemed to curve toward a small clearing, hidden among the trees. As I approached, I slowed down, trying to move quietly. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a park ranger or another hiker who had gotten lost, just like I had. But as I stepped into the clearing, I froze. There, in the middle of the open space, was a large, makeshift campfire. It was recently used, there were still smoldering embers. But what made my blood run cold were the things lying next to the fire. A torn backpack, a worn pair of boots, a jacket. My heart pounded in my chest, and I suddenly felt very, very small. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and head back to the trail, to forget this whole thing. But I couldn't. I had to know what had happened here. I carefully stepped forward, scanning the area for any signs of life. The camp looked abandoned, but there was something about it. Something off. The gear was too neatly arranged, too clean, for someone who had been camping for an extended period. It looked almost staged. Then, my gaze fell on something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A large, heavy branch was lying on the ground nearby, stained dark red. I took a step closer, my stomach churning. That wasn't from an animal. I backed away slowly, panic rising in my chest. Someone had been here, and whatever had happened, it wasn't good. I turned, ready to run, but as I did, I heard a noise behind me. Heavy breathing. Someone was there. Without thinking, I bolted. My feet pounded the earth as I sprinted back toward the trail. The woods were closing in around me, the trees seeming to blur together. I wasn't sure how much time passed. Minutes? Seconds? Before I reached the ridge and saw the familiar trail below me. But as I descended, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran all the way back to the parking lot, never once slowing my pace. By the time I reached my car, my heart was hammering in my chest, and I was drenched in sweat, but I didn't care. I didn't even hesitate before getting in and driving away. The whole way home, my mind raced with what I had seen. The camp, the blood-stained branch, and the strange feeling of being watched. I never found out who had been up there or what had happened to them. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another hiker who had left their gear behind. But part of me knew that something wasn't right. The forest that day had felt wrong from the start, and whatever had happened there, I was glad I got out when I did. That was the last time I hiked alone. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the solitude of nature. Some people seek the comfort of crowds or the excitement of cities, but for me, the mountains have always been home. The crisp air, the endless stretches of trees, and the peace that comes with the hum of nature. It's my escape. I didn't need anyone around to enjoy it, I told myself. I'd been hiking alone for years, venturing into trails far off the beaten path, where only the occasional hiker would pass by. That was until this one fateful trip. Started as any other. I'd taken the day off from work, packed my gear, and decided to explore a part of the woods I hadn't visited in over a year. The trail was secluded, far enough from the usual crowded spots, and I thought it would be a good way to enjoy a peaceful day alone. I had no particular destination in mind, just the usual routine. Hike in, take some photos, and then head back before dark. No rush. No danger. I woke up early, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue across the landscape. I checked my gear. A sturdy pair of boots, my backpack with water, snacks, first aid kit, and a map of the area. I made sure my phone was fully charged, although I didn't expect to need it. The woods were familiar, even though I hadn't been to this section in a while. There was a sense of comfort in that. I parked my car at the trailhead and set off. The early morning was still cool, the temperature just right for hiking. The trail was soft underfoot, the dirt firm but not too dry, and the occasional burst of color from wildflowers made the path feel welcoming. Birds chirped from high in the trees, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at animals moving through the dense forest. For the first hour or so, everything was perfect. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, my breathing steady, the world around me undisturbed. There was no sign of anyone else on the trail, which suited me just fine. I had learned to appreciate the silence. It was a perfect day to get away from everything and everyone. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and thick, twisting upward to block most of the sunlight. It became a bit harder to see, the shadows longer, but I wasn't bothered. I knew the trail. I'd walked this path years ago and had no reason to believe anything would be different this time. But I was wrong. The further I went, the more the silence seemed to stretch. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet of the wilderness. This silence felt different, almost like it was waiting for something, or maybe I was just overthinking it. I've had long stretches of silence before, and usually it's something I appreciate. But today it felt heavier. I stopped to drink some water and take a break. As I crouched down by a small creek, I noticed how still the water was. No fish darting around, no movement at all. Just stillness. A strange, unnerving stillness. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks. I took another swig from my bottle, then continued down the path. A couple more hours passed, and I was completely alone in the woods. By now, the trail had completely disappeared beneath the undergrowth, and I was left to follow my instincts. I could hear the wind stirring the leaves, the occasional distant call of a hawk, but otherwise, the woods were eerily quiet. I wasn't worried at first. After all, I'd hiked alone plenty of times before. But as I kept moving, I started noticing things that weren't quite right. Small things, but they started to add up. A faint smell of something. Rotting? It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, faint and sour, hanging in the air. I paused to sniff, but the smell didn't linger long enough for me to figure out where it was coming from. Then, as I was walking along the edge of a small ridge, I saw something odd. Pile of rocks. It was carefully stacked, much too deliberate to be just a natural formation. I stepped closer, squatting down to inspect it. It was the kind of thing someone would do to mark a spot, or maybe leave a sign for other hikers. But there was no trail here, no sign of others. I stood there for a moment, staring at the stack, trying to make sense of it. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost drowned by the wind, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. A snap of a twig. I whipped around, my heart racing. There was no one. The forest was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. But the noise had been real. I looked around again, my eyes scanning the trees, the underbrush, anything that might explain what I'd heard. But there was nothing. I wasn't sure what to do. My first instinct was to turn back, to retrace my steps and get to the car as quickly as possible. But there was something about the way the forest felt that made me hesitate. The air felt dense, the shadows longer than they should be. The quiet was unnerving now, no longer peaceful but ominous, as though the forest was holding its breath. I pushed on, trying to convince myself that I was just overreacting. It had to be an animal, a deer or something, that made the noise. After all, I was deep in the woods, and wild animals roamed these areas all the time. But then I noticed something else. The trees. The branches seemed to be leaning in, not in a natural way, but almost like they were closing in on me. The trail was narrowing again, but this time it felt intentional, as though the forest was constricting around me. I kept moving, but my pace quickened. The sense of unease grew with every step. And then I heard it again. Another snap, closer this time. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse pounding in my ears. My eyes darted around, my breath shallow. I was no longer alone. I could feel it now. Something was out there, watching me. The rustling in the underbrush grew louder, and I knew then that it wasn't just a deer. It was something else, something that was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one in sight. Then it hit me, the map. I hadn't checked it in a while, and I realized I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Maybe I was lost, but I was sure I knew this area. I thought I did. I fumbled in my bag for the map, unfolding it quickly, but when I looked down, my heart sank. The lines on the map didn't match the landscape. The trail wasn't supposed to look like this. It was as if the map didn't correspond with what I was seeing. My stomach dropped. That's when I heard the voice. Not words, just a sound, almost like a low growl, coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The growl wasn't from an animal, though. It didn't sound like anything natural. My legs froze. My mind raced. I knew I had to move, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, and my skin prickled with the unmistakable feeling of being hunted. I turned back to the trail, moving as quickly as I dared without making a sound. Every step seemed to echo. Every rustle in the leaves made my stomach tighten. I had no choice but to keep going. I couldn't go back the way I came. I just have to keep moving forward, hoping to find my way back to the main trail. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled into a small clearing. The air felt different here, lighter, as though something had shifted. The trees seemed to open up, allowing a shaft of sunlight to pierce through the canopy. It was enough to break the tension. I was no longer being followed. I looked around, trying to gather my bearings. The map, the trail, everything was confusing, but the clearing felt like a turning point. Maybe, just maybe, I had made it through whatever had been lurking behind me. I took a deep breath and, for the first time in hours, I felt a sense of calm. The silence wasn't threatening anymore. It was peaceful. I was going to be okay. I found the trail again, clearer now, and started the long walk back. The woods still felt strange, but the worst of it was over. When I finally saw my car in the distance, parked at the edge of the trail, I could hardly believe I had made it out. I didn't talk to anyone about it, not at first. It wasn't until I got home and thought about it that I realized just how close I had come to losing myself. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else, but I was certain of one thing. The woods that day had felt alive in a way I wasn't prepared for. It took me a while before I ventured back out into those woods again, and even then, it was different. I didn't go as deep, didn't stray too far from the main trail. Maybe some things are better left unexplored. But one thing was for sure, I would never go back alone again. I had never intended for this hike to become anything close to what it turned into. I was just looking for a bit of solitude, a little break from the chaos of everyday life, something to clear my mind. The mountain range I was hiking through was known for its peace and isolation, an ideal spot to escape for a couple of days. I had chosen a less popular trail, one that was rugged, winding, and far from the regular tourist paths. No need to worry about overcrowded campsites or noisy groups. Just me, the wild, and my thoughts. That was the plan. But nature, it seems, doesn't care about plans. I started out early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The cold air had that crisp feeling to it, the kind that makes you feel awake before you've even had your first sip of water. I had packed everything I needed: a good-sized backpack, a tent, sleeping bag, a stove for cooking, plenty of food, and a couple of first aid supplies, just in case. My boots were well-worn but reliable, the kind that have molded perfectly to your feet after years of use. The trail was narrow at first, cutting through thick underbrush, and I felt the quietude of the place wrap around me. The sound of my boots crunching against the dry leaves was the only noise that accompanied me for hours. The occasional bird would call out from the trees, but otherwise, there was no sign of life. That's what I liked about it. It felt like I was the only person in the world, walking through this ancient wilderness, untouched and undisturbed. I started to feel at ease. But then, after a few hours of hiking, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed to be shifting. The path I had been following had gradually begun to fade, the well-trodden dirt turning into loose gravel and thick roots. It was as if the trail was resisting my progress, trying to push me off in different directions. I stopped for a moment, glanced at my map, and realized something. I should have reached the old ranger station by now, or at least come to an area where the trail would have been clearer. My heart skipped a beat. There was a part of me, deep down, that knew I wasn't lost. I had hiked enough to recognize the signs of a good trail and a bad one, but I was starting to feel like I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I pushed on, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched started creeping up my spine. It wasn't anything obvious, not a voice or a figure, but more like the sense that something was out there, keeping track of my every step. I tried shaking it off, but it clung to me like a shadow. I reached a clearing around noon, the sun now high above me, warming the air. It was a perfect spot to rest, so I set down my pack and sat on a large rock near the edge of the clearing. The view from here was magnificent. I could see the rolling hills in the distance, the jagged peaks beyond. There was something surreal about it, like a scene painted by an artist who'd never seen a bad day in their life. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. I didn't feel thirsty, but I felt like I needed the comfort of routine. I rested for about 30 minutes, enjoying the stillness of the place. No animals, no rustling leaves, not even the occasional call of a distant bird. The air was still and it felt almost too quiet. When I stood up to continue, I noticed something unusual on the ground, near the base of a tree. A footprint. It was large, easily a size 14 boot print, deeply imprinted into the dirt. What made it strange was how fresh it looked. It was too clean, too recent to be anything from the previous night. I took a step back, my senses going into alert mode. It wasn't mine, of that I was certain, but there was something off about it. The shape seemed wrong somehow. The print was deeper than it should have been, like the person who left it had been standing there for a while. I was no expert on tracking, but I knew enough to understand that this wasn't normal. I crouched down, my hands instinctively reaching for my knife. I looked around, scanning the trees and the horizon for any signs of movement. Nothing. The trees seemed to sway in the gentle breeze, their leaves rustling in a way that felt almost too quiet. I knew I was being paranoid. I had seen footprints before on the trails, remnants left by other hikers or hunters. But something about this felt wrong. Something in the way the earth seemed disturbed, as if someone had been here just moments before me. I decided to press on, but now the trail felt more isolated, more hostile. Every sound, every creak of a branch, every snap of a twig underfoot felt magnified. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was just overthinking things. There was nothing to worry about. Yet, every time I glanced over my shoulder, it felt like there was something watching me. I spent the next few hours walking through increasingly difficult terrain. The forest grew denser, the trees taller and closer together. The trail disappeared entirely, leaving me to find my own path through thick undergrowth and tangled roots. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The temperature was dropping fast, and I knew I had to make camp before it got too dark. I found a small ridge and set up my tent. The ground was hard, the rocks poking through the thin fabric of my sleeping pad. I built a small fire, the flames flickering weakly in the cold wind, but it provided enough warmth to keep me from shivering. I cooked a quick dinner, some rice and beans, and then sat by the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and crackled. As the night deepened, I began to hear strange noises, sounds I couldn't place. They weren't animal sounds, not like the rustle of a squirrel or the chirp of a nocturnal bird. These sounds were closer, almost human-like, but not quite. A footstep, a snap of a twig, something more deliberate, something that wasn't just the normal sounds of the forest. I sat up straighter, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. My heart began to race, though I couldn't explain why. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees around me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the campsite. Nothing. The world was silent again, save for the crackle of the fire. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. It was like the weight of the silence was pressing in on me. I decided to crawl into my tent and zip it up tight, though I knew it wouldn't protect me from much if something really was out there. The wind howled against the walls of the tent, and the temperature dropped even further, making it hard to get comfortable. I kept the flashlight close, shining it intermittently through the mesh windows. Hours passed, and I began to nod off, my exhaustion overtaking my fear. But then, just as I was about to fall into a deep sleep, I heard it, a loud, unmistakable thud. Someone was outside. My eyes shot open, my breath caught in my chest. I held my breath, listening intently, but all I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. Then, another thud, closer this time. I grabbed my knife and held it in my hand, ready for whatever might come through that door. My pulse thundered in my neck, my hands slick with sweat. But as I waited, there was no movement, no sound. It was as if the world itself had fallen completely still. I was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard the thud again, followed by something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. A voice. Not a whisper, not a shout, just a faint murmur. And then the sound of something heavy shifting, dragging across the ground. I knew in that moment that I wasn't alone. But I also knew that if I didn't leave, I might never get out of here. Without thinking, I grabbed my pack, unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, and crawled out into the dark night. The fire had burned low, barely glowing, but I could still see the shapes of the trees around me. I didn't look back as I made my way through the thick brush, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. The further I went, the more I heard the strange noises around me. Footsteps, whispers, something dragging behind me, just out of reach. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning with each breath. Finally, I reached the main trail again, the path that I had wandered off of earlier. The trail seemed familiar, like it was calling me back. Without hesitation, I followed it, my steps urgent and wild. By the time I reached the nearest ranger station, the sun was just beginning to rise. I stumbled inside, out of breath, shaking with adrenaline. The ranger at the desk looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. I didn't say much, couldn't. There was nothing to explain that would make any sense. But I knew one thing: I was never going back there again. Some places, some trails are better left untouched. The wilderness is full of things you can't understand. Sometimes it's better to just leave them alone. The ranger took my name down, asked if I was okay, but I just nodded. I was as okay as I could be after everything that happened. I'll never hike that trail again. I had been hiking for hours, the air crisp and cold as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The trail I was following was narrow, winding between thick trees and steep slopes. I loved this time of day, the quiet between afternoon and night when the world seemed to settle. But there was an edge of something uncomfortable in the atmosphere. It wasn't unusual for me to hike alone. I enjoyed the solitude, the sense of independence that came with knowing I could rely only on myself. The trail I was on wasn't particularly challenging, but it was remote, something I liked about it. I had hiked it before, though not in years. The forest here was dense, with towering trees whose branches arched high above, blocking most of the sunlight. The path was mostly dirt and loose rocks, narrowing as it followed the base of a slope that rose on one side and dropped off on the other. To my left, I could hear the faint sound of running water, a stream somewhere hidden behind the trees. I kept my pace steady, my boots crunching on the gravel and dirt beneath me. The cool air stung my lungs with each breath, but in a way that felt refreshing, almost invigorating. I had planned for a short hike, just a few miles to clear my head after a stressful week. It was supposed to be an easy trip, a quick escape from reality. About an hour into the hike, the sun had almost set completely. The sky was turning a deep shade of orange, the clouds painted in streaks of purple and pink. The chill in the air was becoming more pronounced, a reminder that nightfall wasn't far away. I should have turned back then, but I pushed on, feeling the pull of the forest. The trail was still well marked, and I had a map with me, so I wasn't concerned. Not yet. As I walked, my eyes began to scan the forest more carefully. There was something about the place that felt off. It wasn't just the silence, though that in itself was unsettling, but there was a certain stillness in the air that seemed to weigh everything down. No animals scurrying about, no birds calling overhead. The trees loomed, thick and imposing, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. Even the ground underfoot felt wrong, as though something in the earth was pressing up against it from beneath. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild, but the feeling remained. By the time I came to a clearing, the sun had disappeared entirely, and the sky had darkened to a deep blue. The shadows of the trees were long and stretching across the ground, and the quiet seemed louder in the absence of light. I stopped to take a break, pulling my water bottle from my backpack and taking a long drink. The cool water refreshed me, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. My mind kept flicking to the possibility of someone else being out here with me, someone or something hidden just beyond the trees. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that made me jump. I stood for a moment listening. The only sounds were the creaking of the trees and the faint, distant rush of the stream. I started moving again, my feet taking me further into the darkening forest. After a while, I found myself at the edge of a steep incline. The trail became more treacherous here, the dirt loose and gravelly. I paused, looking down at the slope that dropped sharply to the valley below. The trail, however, seemed to continue to the right, where the trees clustered even thicker. A slight sense of dread rose in me, but I ignored it, deciding to follow the path. As I walked on, the trees grew denser, and the trail became narrower. The ground underfoot was uneven, full of rocks and roots that made every step a challenge. I hadn't seen another soul since I started, and the eerie silence seemed to grow with each step. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, the feeling of being watched creeping up my spine. I couldn't pinpoint when it happened, but at some point, I realized that the path I was following no longer looked familiar. The trees were different, the way they arched overhead felt wrong. I glanced at my map, only to find that the area I was in wasn't marked. That was strange. I had taken this route before, and I was sure it led in the direction I needed to go. But now I wasn't so sure. Panic slowly began to build in my chest, though I tried to remain calm. It wasn't the first time I'd gotten off track while hiking. I knew that staying calm was the most important thing in situations like this. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but I had no signal, not a single bar. I kept walking, hoping to find some sign of where I was, or at least a trail marker. My pace quickened, my mind racing. The feeling of unease had turned into full-blown anxiety. The trees seemed to grow even denser, the path twisting in a way that made me question if I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and soon I found myself standing at the edge of the stream I had heard earlier. The water was fast-moving, cutting through the rocks, its surface foaming as it tumbled downstream. I stood for a moment, trying to decide whether to cross it or backtrack. The map didn't show a stream, but there was something instinctively pulling me to the other side. I took a deep breath and stepped into the water, the cold rush against my boots making me shiver. As I crossed, I felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in the atmosphere. My heart began to race again. The woods had gone completely silent, as if holding its breath. I reached the far bank of the stream and paused for a moment to collect myself. But that's when I heard it, the faintest of sounds, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I turned, scanning the darkening woods. I couldn't see anything, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I had been alone this whole time, hadn't I? I started moving again, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound around me. My footsteps felt too loud, the rustling of my jacket too obvious. The woods felt different, closer, more alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I turned another corner, and suddenly, I came to a stop. Before me was an abandoned cabin, nestled in a small clearing. It looked old, no ancient. Its wood faded and cracked, the roof sagging in spots. It was completely still, the windows dark, the door slightly ajar. I stood there for a long moment, trying to decide whether to approach it or turn back. There was something about the place that felt wrong, off. But curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. I didn't know why, but I couldn't stop myself. Maybe it was the sense of isolation that made me want to investigate, to find something familiar, even if it was a rundown old cabin in the woods. I reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The hinges squealed in protest, and the air inside smelled of mildew and decay. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with dust and cobwebs, and there was a faint smell of rot that made my stomach churn. There were old, broken-down furniture pieces scattered about, their frames splintered and warped. It was as if someone had left in a hurry. But as I moved deeper into the cabin, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart began to pound harder. Someone was in the cabin with me. I woke up to the cool, fresh mountain air filling the inside of my tent, the soft rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds echoing through the forest. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the sky was lightening, casting a pale orange glow across the treetops. I had spent the night alone in the woods, something I had done many times before, but something about this particular morning felt off. It was that feeling in the pit of your stomach, that instinct that tells you something is not quite right. Still, I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone in such a vast, untamed place. I unzipped the door of my tent and stepped out, the damp earth cool beneath my boots. The forest around me was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. It was a familiar sound, a sound that used to soothe me. I'd been hiking for years, traversing mountains and forests, camping in places where few others ever ventured. There was a certain kind of peace in the solitude, a peace that often got me through the toughest of days. But today wasn't like the others. I had planned on hiking up to the peak of Blackstone Ridge, a long and somewhat challenging trail that wound through dense woods before breaking out into a vast, open ridge at the top. From there, the view was supposed to be breathtaking, a panorama of the entire valley below. It had been a dream hike for me, one I had saved for years. I had all the supplies I needed: food, water, a map, and even a satellite phone in case of emergencies. I double-checked everything, making sure I was ready for the day ahead. My backpack was packed tightly, my water bottle filled. It was still early, and the forest was mostly untouched by the day's heat. I decided to get an early start. I left my tent behind, setting out on the trail with the sun climbing higher in the sky. The path was narrow at first, winding between large trees and underbrush. The ground was soft, spongy from the morning dew, and the air smelled fresh, a mixture of pine and damp earth. I moved steadily, trying to enjoy the solitude while still being aware of my surroundings. I was used to being alone in the woods, but there was something different about today. I couldn't quite place it. As the hours passed, the trail became steeper, winding upwards through thick trees. The morning fog had burned off, and the sun was now high enough to cast sharp shadows across the path. I stopped for a quick break, sitting on a fallen log to hydrate and catch my breath. The forest was eerily quiet now. The birds had stopped chirping, and the breeze had died down. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Nature had its moods. Maybe the animals were just further off in the distance, and I had been too focused on my own thoughts to notice. I took another sip of water and continued up the trail. By midday, the trees had thinned, and the trail opened up into a wide, rocky clearing. I was nearing the top of the ridge now. The landscape changed dramatically here. The thick forest gave way to open rock faces, with only sparse patches of vegetation clinging to the cliffs. The air felt thinner, and I could see the valley below stretching out in all directions, the winding river cutting through the green forest like a silver thread. I felt a surge of excitement. This was what I had been working towards. I took out my phone to snap a few pictures, but when I checked the time, I realized I had been hiking for nearly 5 hours. I still had a few more miles to go before reaching the true summit. I should have turned back right then, but something inside me pushed me forward, told me that I had come this far and I couldn't stop now. The trail became more difficult as I ascended, the rocks growing steeper and more unstable. It was slow going, but I was determined. I had trained for this hike for months, and I wasn't going to let a little difficulty stop me. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, like a crackling noise, almost like a twig snapping in the distance. I paused, straining my ears. There was no wind, no breeze, nothing that would explain the noise. It didn't sound like an animal either. It sounded deliberate, almost like something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush nearby. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart beating just a little faster. I had heard strange noises before in the woods, but this one felt different. My mind raced. Could it be another hiker? Maybe someone else was coming up the trail behind me? I turned around and scanned the path below, but there was no one in sight. I pushed the thought aside and continued upwards, telling myself it was nothing. But the noise persisted. It seemed to be coming closer, like someone was following me. I quickened my pace, but my mind wouldn't settle. I glanced over my shoulder every few steps, convinced that someone was there, someone who might be watching me. But each time, the trail behind me was empty. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the summit. It was nothing like I expected. The ridge was flat and barren, the rocks jagged and unforgiving. There was no view. The trees had been replaced by sharp rock formations that cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. I took a deep breath, relieved to have reached the top, but still, something nagged at the back of my mind. I set up camp quickly, my movements mechanical as I tried to shake off the creeping unease that had taken root in me. I hadn't heard any noises for a while, but the feeling of being watched had not left. I tried to focus on the task at hand, setting up my tent and arranging my gear, but the silence around me was deafening. The wind had picked up slightly, whipping through the rocks, and I could hear it howling across the ridgeline. I sat down on a flat rock, trying to relax and enjoy the view, but the moment I sat still, the feeling came back, that feeling of being not alone. As night began to fall, I realized I hadn't heard a single animal. No owls, no coyotes, no rustling in the bushes. It was like the entire forest had gone silent just for me. The shadows stretched longer across the rocks as the sun dipped lower, and for the first time, I felt a real sense of dread. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, the silence, the isolation. It was all normal. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. I had been hiking for hours, the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt trail, the only sound breaking the silence of the forest around me. It was a late autumn afternoon, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the path. The air was cool but not cold, a perfect day for a hike, I thought. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of birds calling to each other. I hadn't planned on this being a long hike. It was just a short, afternoon adventure on a trail I'd heard about from a few people at work. They said it was a bit off the beaten path, but nothing too extreme. The trail, starting out smooth and easy, began to narrow and wind as it led me deeper into the woods. I come across a few people earlier, some on their way down, others going up like me. But by now, the trail had emptied. I had seen no one for the past hour, and the isolation felt strange, like I was slowly leaving the world behind. As I walked, I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for any rocks or roots that might trip me. The trail was getting steeper now, and the trees on either side were growing thicker, blocking out more light. It didn't bother me at first. I was used to being alone in nature, and the deepening shadows didn't feel threatening. But as I continued on, something started to change. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. There was no more rustling of leaves or the distant calls of birds. It felt as if the forest had gone completely still. The only sound was the rhythm of my own breathing and the occasional crunch of dirt under my boots. I paused for a moment to take a sip of water, my gaze sweeping around. The trees, tall and dense, loomed over me, their bare branches creaking in the wind. But that was all, just the trees and me. I decided to push forward, figuring I was nearly to the end of the trail, where I would turn back. The trail was more difficult now, steeper, narrower, and filled with sharp rocks that made each step harder than the last. I was beginning to wonder how much further it was when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, there was no mistaking it. There was something off about the trail ahead. The path had split into two, but one of the paths didn't look like it had been used in a while. The other path, the one I was on, seemed to keep going, but something about the fork made my gut twist. The trail I was on had been getting less and less defined the further I went, but now it was as if the forest was actively trying to close it off, with thick undergrowth starting to creep across the path. I wasn't sure which way to go. The more traveled path was to my left, but the one on the right, though overgrown, looked less steep. In the end, I decided to take the right path. I'd gone far enough, and the thought of going down a steep, uneven trail didn't appeal to me at the moment. The moment I stepped onto the right path, I felt a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, just a slight chill creeping up my spine, but it was enough to make me pause. The forest had grown darker as the sun continued to dip, and it felt as though the trees were closing in, the shadows stretching longer with each passing minute. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my mind, telling myself that it was just my imagination. The path was still there, winding through thick trees and underbrush. But the further I went, the more I realized that this trail didn't seem right. It was unnaturally narrow, the branches on either side clawing at my clothes and pulling at my hair. The trees here were older, their gnarled trunks twisting in odd directions, their bark thick and blackened. A strange scent lingered in the air, something earthy and damp, almost rotting, like the forest had been neglected for years. I continued on, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the very ground itself was reluctant to let me pass. My legs were starting to ache, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would hear a sound, something faint, like the snap of a twig, but when I turned to look, I saw nothing. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding through the dense forest, and the longer I walked, the more I felt like I was sinking deeper into some forgotten corner of the woods. The sun was barely visible now, and the shadows were thick, almost suffocating. I checked my watch. It was almost 5 o'clock, too late to be this deep into the woods, especially with the sun setting so quickly. I should have turned around sooner, but now I was unsure of where I was. The path had grown narrower, so tight in places that I had to push branches aside to keep moving forward. The quiet was oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, filling your head with strange thoughts. I had to get out of here. I turned to go back, but the path seemed different. What had been a clear route only moments before now felt like a labyrinth, with the trees closing in on all sides. I retraced my steps, trying to follow the landmarks I had passed earlier, the large rock by the side of the trail, the tree that looked like it had a face. But nothing looked familiar anymore. The forest had changed. It was as though I had been walking in circles, the same trees and rocks appearing over and over, as if mocking me. My heart was racing now, my breath shallow. Panic was beginning to set in. I stopped for a moment to steady myself, pulling out my phone to check the map. No service. Of course, there wouldn't be any service out here. I kept moving, now in a state of near panic, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The woods had never felt like this before. This suffocating, this alive with something I couldn't explain. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump, and the cold, damp feeling at the back of my neck wouldn't go away. Suddenly, I heard a noise, clearer this time, a faint rustling ahead. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one around. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew something was there, watching me. It felt like the trees themselves were leaning closer, the air heavier with each breath. I picked up the pace, desperate to find my way back, but the forest seemed to mock me with its endless maze. The path split again, and for a moment, I froze. The narrow trail ahead was unfamiliar, but I had no choice. I had to keep going. Then, just as I was beginning to lose all hope, I saw it. A clearing in the distance, a break in the trees. My heart leapt, and I pushed myself forward with all the energy I had left. I reached the clearing, and there, standing in the middle, was the trailhead I had passed earlier, the one that led me up this cursed path. I took a deep breath, relief flooding my chest. I wasn't lost after all. I had found my way back. It was then that I realized, looking around at the trees, that the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. The feeling of being watched was gone, and everything felt normal, like I had just walked through some kind of dark veil. I made my way down the trail, keeping a steady pace, but this time, the woods felt different, lighter. The sun had nearly set, but I could see the road ahead, the familiar parking lot just beyond the trees. And in the distance, the quiet hum of cars. I was almost out. As I crossed the parking lot, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the forest still staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the evening sky, fading into the night. I didn't look back again. I had taken time off work for a solo hiking trip deep into the backcountry. I needed a break. The stress was getting to me. My plan was simple: a 4-day hike into a remote part of the Rocky Mountains. No people, no emails, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and miles of trail through forests and ridges I had only studied on maps. I'd been planning the route for weeks. I researched topography, marked old Forest Service roads, and saved coordinates. It was an area where few people went. That was the point. I was chasing the quiet, the silence that only comes when you're hours from cell signal, where the wind is the only thing you hear. I parked my truck on the edge of a logging road just before sunrise. The air was cold, biting, the kind of chill that sinks through fleece. I locked the doors, hoisted my pack, and started walking. I had 24 miles to cover to reach the old fire lookout where I'd planned to camp the third night. The trail wasn't marked. It wasn't even really a trail, just an old game path that vanished in places. The first few hours were peaceful. The ground was still frozen from the night. My boots crunched softly on frost-covered pine needles. I didn't see a soul, only signs of elk and the occasional rabbit darting off into the underbrush. Around midday, I stopped to eat a sandwich and drink some water near a small stream. I took my boots off, let my feet breathe. I was about 7 miles in. My GPS was working, but I was switching it off every so often to save battery. The area was dense with pine and spruce, broken only by the occasional meadow or rock outcrop. By the second afternoon, I was deep into the wilderness. No service, no people, just endless trees and thick brush. I'd been following a narrow ridge, climbing steadily through switchbacks and rocky paths. I camped that night next to a cluster of boulders with a view of the valley below. I built a small fire and boiled water for pasta. The night was still and quiet. No wind, not even the usual owl calls. It was that kind of quiet where your ears ring a little. In the morning, I kept climbing. The terrain got rougher. The trees thinned. I crossed 2 dry stream beds, one still filled with icy patches. Around noon, I found boot prints. Fresh. I stopped cold. They were going the same direction as me, heading up. The weird part was, there were no prints coming down. That didn't make sense. I hadn't seen another vehicle. The area wasn't well known. Most hikers wouldn't even bother coming out this far unless they were experienced. I stood there, staring at the prints. They were bigger than mine, wide and deep. Heavy boots, the kind military or utility workers wear. I kept walking, more alert now, listening harder. I heard nothing. The woods felt empty, but I started noticing more things. Scuffed bark, broken branches, a cigarette but next to a tree. I hadn't seen litter since the trailhead. I didn't like the feeling, but I pushed on. The fire lookout was only a few more miles. I followed the ridge until I reached a small clearing. That's where I saw it. It wasn't the fire lookout. It was a building. Low, squat, made of cinder blocks, painted brown and green to blend in. It was tucked back under a line of trees with camouflage netting thrown over the top. No windows, just a single metal door. I dropped to the ground without thinking. My heart was pounding. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near a building like that. There were no structures marked on any map I had studied. I looked through the trees. No signs, no roads, no fences. Just this weird block building in the middle of nowhere. I crawled back into the woods, keeping low. I sat behind a log and waited. I didn't see anyone. No movement, no smoke, no sound. But something about the place didn't feel abandoned. I took a slow path around it, staying in the trees. I circled wide, keeping at least 50 yards away. On the far side, there were tire tracks, deep ones. Not old. The mud was still damp. I followed them and found a hidden road, overgrown but clear enough for an off-road vehicle. It disappeared downhill into thick forest. I stood there for a long time, weighing what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but something else pushed me forward. Curiosity or stupidity, I'm not sure. I followed the tracks down the road for maybe a quarter mile. That's when I heard the sound. Faint, a hum, like generators. Then I caught a whiff of fuel in the air. Diesel. I crept closer until I saw a fence. It was high, barbed wire on top. On the other side were 2 more buildings. Bigger, also camouflaged. And vehicles, military-style jeeps, 2 ATVs, and what looked like a black panel van. This was not some hiker cabin or old ranger post. This was something else. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I knew I shouldn't be there. I backed away slowly. No sudden moves. I retraced my steps and got back to the upper ridge before dark. I didn't stop. I hiked through dusk and into night, guided by headlamp, until I found a flat spot under some pine trees. I didn't make a fire. I didn't even eat. I just lay in my bag, heart racing, trying to stay warm and silent. The next morning, I took a different route back, cut across a ridgeline and descended into a valley I hadn't planned on. The terrain was rough, no trail. I bushwhacked for hours, slipping on moss-covered rocks, scraping my legs on thorns. I crossed a shallow creek and climbed another hill to stay off any roads. I wasn't sure who those people were or what they were doing out there, but I knew I had seen something I wasn't meant to. I camped again the third night near a ravine, far off course. I had enough food to last, but I was burning through water fast. I filtered what I could from streams, but some were nearly dry. I was exhausted. My legs ached. My boots were soaked through. The fourth day, I hit the old Forest Service road about 5 miles from where I had left my truck. I moved fast, barely resting, checking over my shoulder every half hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. When I reached the truck, everything looked normal. No damage, no signs anyone had been there. I threw my gear in the back and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe. Back home, I tried to figure out what I had stumbled on. I searched online for anything: military training zones, illegal grow ops, research stations, but nothing matched. I checked satellite images. The road was visible, but the buildings were covered or blurred. I thought about reporting it, but who would believe me? I had no photos. I hadn't taken any. It felt stupid now, but at the time I was more focused on not getting caught than documenting anything. A few weeks later, I drove back to the area. Not to hike, just to check the logging road. There were fresh tire tracks leading in. But when I tried to follow them, a new gate had been installed. Heavy steel, locked, no signs, no warnings, just a gate in the middle of nowhere with a fresh chain and new paint. I haven't gone back since. I don't know what I saw. I don't think it was military. The vehicles were too clean. The whole setup was too hidden. It wasn't a weather station or a fire lookout or anything like that. It felt like something not meant to be found. Whatever it was, it's out there, still operating, still hidden. And if I hadn't chosen that random trail, I would have never known it even existed. Now, every time I go hiking, I wonder what else is hidden out there. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people doing things in the shadows, counting on nobody ever finding them. And for the most part, they're right, but not always. It was early October when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in northern Idaho. I had been planning it for months. The air was getting colder, the days shorter, and most people had already packed away their hiking gear for the year. That was exactly why I went then. I wanted the solitude. I didn't want other people around me, taking pictures every few steps or talking loudly the whole way up. I needed the quiet, the peace, just nature and me. I chose a remote trail near the Selkirk Mountains, one that wasn't very popular, especially that late in the season. I had read about it in an old hiking blog. The guy who wrote it said it was beautiful, a bit overgrown in parts, but led to a hidden alpine lake that wasn't even on most maps. He said it took about 2 days to reach the lake and another 2 to hike back if you took your time. That sounded perfect to me. I drove out early in the morning, stopping at a small town an hour away from the trailhead to top off my gas and grab a hot breakfast. The road out to the starting point was rough, full of potholes, but I didn't mind. I liked that it kept people away. When I got there, I saw one other truck parked off to the side, covered in dirt and leaves like it had been there a while. I assumed it belonged to a hunter or someone backpacking deep into the woods for a few days. I geared up slowly, double-checked my supplies. I had a large pack with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, fuel, freeze-dried food, bear spray, first aid kit, GPS, compass, map, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and multiple layers of clothing. I was always overly cautious when I hiked alone. I told my brother where I was going, left a printed map with him that had the exact trail marked and when I expected to be back. I planned to check in with him on my satellite messenger every night. If I missed 2 check-ins, he'd call for help. That was the rule. It was around 9 a.m. when I started up the trail. The first few miles were peaceful. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the trail was just wide enough to follow without too much effort. It was chilly, probably in the low 40s, but I warmed up fast with the hike. The trees were dense, the leaves on the ground already turning deep orange and red. I I didn't hear anything but the wind and the occasional bird call. The trail slowly got narrower. Fallen branches and brush had started to creep across it, and in some places I had to stop and push my way through thick undergrowth. Still, it wasn't anything crazy. I'd done worse. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped by a stream to refill my water bottles and eat a quick lunch. I didn't see a single person all day, and by the time I set up camp just before sunset, I was at least 12 miles in. I picked a spot near a dry patch of land above a small ravine. I could hear the sound of running water below, which meant I wouldn't have to go far to refill again. I set up my tent, made some hot food, and checked in with my brother using my sat messenger. I remember sitting there with the last light of the day stretching out over the trees, just enjoying the quiet. It was peaceful, that kind of silence you don't get anywhere near people. That night, it got cold. I had packed a good sleeping bag, so I wasn't uncomfortable, but the temperature dropped fast, and I had to sleep with my water filter inside my bag so it wouldn't freeze. Around midnight, I woke up to some noise outside my tent. Not loud, just leaves crunching lightly. I stayed still, listening. I figured it was probably a deer or raccoon, but I unzipped my bag slowly and reached for my bear spray just in case. After a minute or two, the sound stopped. I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake for another half hour, straining to hear more, but it stayed quiet. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. I didn't see any tracks or signs of anything coming close. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a small animal. Still, I felt a little off. It wasn't fear exactly, just unease, like something had shifted, but I shook it off. I was out in the wilderness, after all. Nature wasn't quiet like a house. It was always moving, always alive. That second day, the hike got harder. The trail was steeper, and in some places, almost completely swallowed by plants. I had to stop a few times to hack through thorns and low branches. Around noon, I came across something strange. A rusted-out metal frame that looked like it used to be part of a small shelter or maybe an old trail sign. It was bent and covered in moss, half sunk into the ground. Nearby, there were some old beer cans, completely rusted through. That was the first sign I'd seen that anyone had been out here in years. Later that afternoon, I passed through a narrow pass between two rock walls. On the other side, the woods got thicker. The trees were closer together, and the light dimmed fast. I kept going, though. My GPS said I was still on the right track. By evening, I was tired. I hadn't seen the lake yet, but I figured I'd find it early the next morning. I made camp in a small clearing, and again, I didn't see or hear anything that suggested people had been nearby recently. I was alone. That night, I woke up again to that same sound, light movement outside my tent. This time, it was closer. I stayed still, holding my breath. Something brushed against the side of the tent. Not hard, just a soft drag like a hand or a branch. I sat up slowly, grabbed the bear spray, and turned on my flashlight. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited. After a few minutes, the noise stopped again. I listened for what felt like an hour, but heard nothing else. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked outside. There were no tracks, no prints, no disturbed leaves. But this time I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had touched the tent. I felt it. I thought maybe a branch had fallen from a tree or maybe an animal had passed by and brushed against the side. But nothing looked out of place. Still, I was determined to make it to the lake, get some pictures, and head back down. I figured I'd just hike faster and maybe make it back in one long push if I started early enough the next morning. That day, I found the lake. It was beautiful, totally still, surrounded by cliffs and thick forest. The water was clear enough to see rocks beneath the surface even from 10 feet above. I sat by the shore and ate lunch, just watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the water. It should have felt peaceful, but I still couldn't shake that feeling from the night before. The silence felt too heavy, like something was waiting. I didn't stay long. I wanted to get at least a few miles back down the trail before nightfall. I packed up quickly and moved fast. My legs were sore, and I kept glancing behind me, even though I never saw anything. Just before sunset, I reached a spot that felt familiar. I remembered a large tree that had fallen across the trail. I had climbed over it 2 days before. As I approached it again, I stopped. Someone had moved it. Not the whole tree, it was too big. But someone had stripped the branches off it. The bark was torn in strips, peeled away in long, rough cuts. Not done with a saw or tool. More like it had been pulled off with something sharp and crude. And next to the trunk, I saw a pile of rocks stacked into a small pyramid. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. They weren't natural either. Someone had placed them there deliberately. That was the moment I knew for certain I wasn't alone out there. I kept walking faster now. I didn't stop to rest. I just wanted to get as far away from that spot as I could before it got dark. I ended up camping on a rocky slope a few miles further down. No fire, no hot food, just dry snacks and water. I didn't want to draw attention. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone watching me from the trees. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something sharp snapping nearby. Not a small branch, a loud crack, like a heavy footstep. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The wind was still, no movement, but I didn't sleep again. At first light, I packed up in 10 minutes and started moving. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I just hiked. Around mid-morning, I passed a small stream I remembered from the first day. I stopped there briefly to drink and fill my bottle. When I stood up, I noticed something across the water, a figure standing just inside the trees. I froze. They weren't moving, just standing. I couldn't see their face, too many branches in the way, but I could tell it was a person. Not a bear, not a shadow, a man. I turned and walked fast down the trail. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. For the next 3 hours, I kept hearing sounds behind me. Sticks breaking, leaves rustling. Every time I stopped, it stopped too. I wanted to run, but the trail was too rough. One wrong step and I'd be down with a broken ankle. So I just pushed forward, faster than before, not thinking about food or water or anything else. Just the trail, just getting out. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried. I ran the last 100 yards. I threw my pack in the back seat, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. But the engine turned over. I had always been someone who found comfort in the solitude of nature. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the steady rhythm of my boots on the trail, and the silence. No distractions, no one around to make me feel anything but the pure, raw essence of being alone in the wilderness. This time, it was a trail that I'd never hiked before, deep in the mountains where the map seemed to blur with uncertainty. A sense of adventure stirred in me as I packed my gear, anticipating the peace I sought from being out there by myself. The morning started off clear, the sun just peeking over the horizon as I tied my boots tightly and adjusted the straps on my backpack. My plan was simple: hike in a loop around the old forest path, explore some abandoned trailheads, and return by sunset. There was no rush, no real destination except for the fleeting joy of solitude. The trail was narrow at first, winding through thick trees that seemed to close in around me, their roots tangled like old fingers in the earth. The air was cool, the scent of pine heavy in the atmosphere, and I felt the familiar thrill of being fully immersed in the natural world. It wasn't a difficult trail, not by any means, but there was something unsettling about the silence that surrounded me. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that made you hyper-aware of every crunch of a leaf beneath your foot, every rustle in the branches overhead. The birds didn't seem to chirp, and the wind was strangely still. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt off. After a few miles, I came across a small creek, its water clear and cold as it trickled over rocks. I stopped for a moment to take a drink, the chill of the water seeping into my fingers as I cupped my hands. I didn't linger long. The strange feeling of being watched hadn't left me, and it was starting to gnaw at the edges of my mind. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the woods, but it felt like the further I went, the more disconnected I became from everything: time, distance, my own thoughts. It wasn't until late afternoon that I realized I had strayed from the main path. My map was no help. The lines seemed faded, and the trail markers were few and far between. I had only meant to explore a small section of the wilderness, but now I was deep into territory that wasn't familiar, and the realization made my stomach churn. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but I had no idea where I was in relation to the loop I was supposed to finish. I stood for a moment trying to get my bearings, but the trees all looked the same. That's when I heard it, a crack of twigs underfoot. I froze, the blood draining from my face. There was no wind. The birds had gone quiet, and the creek had softened to nothing more than a faint murmur. A rustling came again, this time closer, and I instinctively took a step back, scanning the trees around me. There was no one out here, at least no one I was expecting. My eyes darted left and right, but I didn't see anything. Then the rustling stopped. For several minutes, the silence stretched on like a taut wire, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced at the sky, darker now with storm clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder. It was time to move, I thought. I turned, intending to retrace my steps, but before I could take a full stride, I heard something again. This time, it was unmistakable. A soft, steady thud of footsteps in the distance. Too deliberate to be an animal. Too heavy for a deer or any other small creature. I wasn't alone. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen. I stood there for a long, agonizing moment, staring into the trees, waiting for something to happen. The thunder grew louder, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Then the sound of footsteps came again, much closer now, and I spun on my heel, moving quickly but cautiously. The trail curved sharply to the right, and I followed it, desperate to get away from whatever or whoever was back there. I didn't want to turn around. Every step I took, I imagined someone just behind me, closing the gap with every second. My breath was ragged, my pulse thudding in my ears as the trail became steeper, the trees pressing in tighter around me. I stumbled over a root, my foot catching, but I didn't stop to recover. The urgency in my chest flared, and my mind raced, trying to piece together why I was so certain that something was wrong. What if it was a fellow hiker, I thought? What if someone had gotten lost too? But I knew it wasn't right. Whoever it was, they weren't acting like someone who had simply lost their way. The sound of footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, following me. The trail grew steeper, and I found myself scrambling over rocks, trying to keep my footing as the rain began to fall. It wasn't just a drizzle anymore, it was pouring. The wet ground turned slick, and the storm seemed to move faster than it should have, the wind blowing the rain sideways. I needed to get to higher ground, where I could at least see if I was still being followed. I pushed on, ignoring the pain in my legs and the burning in my chest. The trail was becoming less and less defined, and I realized I was no longer following a marked path. The rain blurred my vision, and my body felt as though it was moving on pure instinct. Then I saw it, a clearing, a small plateau just ahead. I scrambled toward it, hoping that if I could get there, I'd be able to look back and see if I was being followed. As I made my way into the open area, I took a deep breath and turned around. Nothing. The trail behind me was empty. The rain pounded against the ground in waves, and the wind howled through the trees, but there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. My heart still raced, but the silence in the clearing was almost eerie. It felt like I had crossed some invisible line, and now the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I didn't know what had happened, whether it had been an animal or another hiker or something else entirely, but I didn't wait to find out. I made my way toward the highest point in the plateau, a small ridge that gave me a better view of the surrounding area. From there, I could see the storm clouds moving in more quickly than I had anticipated, and I knew I had to hurry if I wanted to make it back to the main trail before dark. As I descended, the rain began to let up, and the shadows stretched long across the landscape. I glanced back one more time, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing, just the trees and the fading light. It wasn't until I finally made it back to the main trail and found my bearings that I realized how close I had come to something I couldn't explain. Whether it was just my mind playing tricks or if something truly had been out there, I would never know. But I wasn't taking any chances. I pushed on, putting as much distance between myself and the unknown as I could. The hike back to the trailhead felt longer than it should have, and by the time I made it to the parking lot, the last traces of daylight had vanished. My legs were sore, my clothes drenched, but there was a sense of relief that washed over me as I reached my car. I didn't speak to anyone, didn't share what had happened on the trail. Some things are better left unsaid. I don't know what I heard or felt that day, but I know this. Some paths are better left unexplored. I wasn't planning on hiking that far when I left the house that morning. I'd only meant to do a quick 5-mile loop near the southern edge of Pine Creek Gorge, but something about the way the cold air smelled and how the sun came through the thin layer of clouds made me keep going. I'd hiked a lot before, but that day felt different, like I needed to be out there longer. It had rained the day before, so the dirt was soft under my boots, and the fallen leaves were still damp and dark. Everything felt clean. I had my pack, a few protein bars, my big steel water bottle, a backup filter straw, a thin jacket, and my phone fully charged. I figured that was more than enough. The trail was marked but not maintained very well. That was part of the charm for me. I wasn't looking for well-groomed switchbacks or gravel paths. I liked the kind of hiking where tree branches hit your arms and mud pulled at your boots. This was that kind of place. The trail followed the ridge for a while, and I could see down into the deep valley, where Pine Creek wound around big mossy rocks. Bare trees stretched out in every direction. It was late fall, so most of the leaves were down already, and the undergrowth was mostly dry ferns and scattered thorn bushes. Cold, silent, and empty, just how I liked it. After about an hour, I passed a wooden sign nailed to a tree. The letters were old and faint, but I could make out Devil's Hollow, 2.3 miles, pointing down a narrow side trail that cut sharply downhill. I'd heard of the place before. Some people said it wasn't safe, but not for any superstitious reason. Just that it was remote, the terrain was rough, and no one maintained it anymore. That was probably why I wanted to go there. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, someplace people didn't bother going anymore, was exactly what I'd been craving. The trail down into the hollow was steep and barely wide enough in some places. It felt like I was walking into a place nature had started to reclaim. The path twisted around boulders and sinkholes filled with dead leaves. I had to step carefully not to twist an ankle. There were patches of rock slick with moss that I had to go around, and at one point I had to sit and slide down a slope too steep to walk. It took longer than I expected, and I was sweating under my jacket even though the air was cold. My legs burned, but I didn't want to stop. I felt like something important was down there waiting. I don't know why. By the time I reached the bottom, the sun was already shifting westward, turning the shadows darker. The trees down in the hollow were massive, taller than anything I'd passed before. Some of the trunks were wide enough to hide a small car behind. The air felt colder down there, and the sound was different. My own footsteps were muffled, and there was this heavy silence, like the ground itself was absorbing sound. I stopped and drank water, ate half a bar, and checked my phone. No signal, but I'd expected that. I had downloaded offline maps, and I still had 78% battery. I wasn't worried. I pushed deeper into the hollow, following what was barely a trail anymore, just a suggestion of one. Fallen logs and brambles made it slow going. I saw deer prints and some smaller tracks I couldn't identify. Nothing alarming. The trail dropped again and curved along a small creek, barely more than a trickle between rocks. That's where I saw the first sign of people in a long time. An old rusted-out metal cooler turned on its side, half buried in leaves and mud. Nearby, there was the frame of a folding chair, collapsed and missing its seat. It didn't look fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. Maybe 10, 15 years old. That told me people had been down here before, though clearly not often. I kept going. The trail started climbing again on the far side of the creek, steeper this time. The ground was soft and crumbly, and I had to use tree roots to pull myself up in places. My pack kept catching on low branches. I was getting tired. I checked the time. It was already past 3, and I was deeper in than I'd planned. I stopped and thought about turning back, but I felt like I'd come too far. I figured I could loop back using a different trail I'd seen on the map earlier. It would be longer, but it wouldn't require going back down and then back up that steep hill. I decided to go forward. About a half-mile farther, the trail disappeared completely into a thicket of underbrush. I tried to go around it and found myself standing in a clearing I hadn't expected. There were no signs, no markings, just a flat spot where the trees were more spaced out and the ground was covered in dry moss and pine needles. That's when I saw the remains of what must have been a cabin. Just the foundation stones and a few rotted beams sticking up like ribs from the earth. The stones were covered in green moss, and inside the footprint of the building were broken glass shards, rusted nails, and the twisted remains of a wood stove. Felt wrong. Not supernatural or anything, I don't believe in that, but wrong in a very physical, grounded way. Like no one should have built anything there to begin with. The trees didn't grow straight around that spot. Some leaned away, and others curved like they were trying to avoid it. I didn't stay long. I circled around it and reconnected with what might have been a game trail or maybe just the easiest way through the trees. That's when I started hearing something strange. Not voices, not animals, but this distant mechanical whine, like a chainsaw or maybe a dirt bike. It was far away, but every now and then it came back again. I couldn't tell the direction. The sound echoed weirdly down there. I paused, listening, trying to make sense of it. It would stop, then come back a minute later. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker or blaze in over an hour. I opened the map again on my phone and zoomed in. According to the GPS dot, I wasn't on any marked trail. I wasn't even close to one. The dot was floating in empty green space. That was when the pit in my stomach formed. I'd been hiking for almost 5 hours, and the sun would be setting soon. I wasn't even sure what direction the nearest trail was. My phone's compass kept spinning, like it couldn't get its bearings. I switched it off and tried to stay calm. I remembered the last fork I passed and figured if I backtracked a mile or so, I could find it and follow it out. I turned around and started moving fast, but nothing looked the same. The underbrush was different, thicker. The trees were spaced differently. I found myself going downhill when I should have been climbing. I tried using landmarks, but everything down there looked the same: trees, rocks, ferns. I started seeing animal bones, scattered vertebrae, ribs, once a full deer skull lying in the grass. All clean, all old. I didn't like it. Then I heard the noise again. Not the whine. This time it was something crashing through the brush nearby, heavy and low to the ground. I froze and crouched, heart pounding. I didn't see anything, but the sound was real. Snapping twigs, a grunt, maybe a bear. I had bear spray, but I'd never used it before. I backed away slowly, eyes scanning the trees. Whatever it was, it didn't follow. The sound faded. I started moving faster. After another half hour of scrambling, I found a tree with a deep notch in it. I recognized it. I'd passed it earlier. I had looped somehow. I wasn't getting out that way. The sun was gone now, only a thin gray light left. My boots were soaked from a creek I'd slipped into, and I was shaking from the cold. I decided to make shelter for the night. I found a hollow between 2 big rocks, built a windbreak with fallen branches, and packed leaves for insulation. I didn't have a sleeping bag or tarp, but I had my emergency foil blanket and jacket. I ate the last of my bars and rationed water. I didn't sleep much. Every noise made me jolt awake. By morning, I was stiff, cold, and hungry, but alive. The light came slowly, filtered by clouds. I packed up and started walking uphill, sticking to one direction using the position of the sun. It was slow going. My phone battery was almost dead, and I saved it for emergencies. I walked for hours, climbing ridges, crossing streams, trying to keep my bearings. Then, just after noon, I heard it, a road. Not a highway, just the low rumble of an engine in the distance. I followed the sound, bushwhacking through thick brush, until I hit a dirt service road. I dropped to my knees when I saw it. I followed the road for almost 3 miles before it connected to a small ranger station. It was locked, but there was a map posted outside. I realized I'd come out more than 8 miles from where I'd entered. I followed the road all the way back to the parking area, where my car was the only one left. I got in, drove to the nearest town, and bought 2 burgers and a gallon of water. I didn't stop shaking until that night. I didn't tell anyone much about it. I wasn't injured, and I made it out, so it felt like it didn't matter. But something about that place still sticks with me. The way the ground felt wrong, the way I couldn't find my way even with a map, the animal bones, the looping trail that took me right back where I started. I still hike, but I never went back to Devil's Hollow. I never will. Not because I'm scared of ghosts or legends, but because sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters. Sometimes it's just the forest itself, quiet, vast, and absolutely indifferent to whether or not you make it out. I started hiking early that morning, just after sunrise. The weather was perfect, cool air, clear sky, and not a cloud in sight. I had planned this solo hike into a canyon area that wasn't super popular, which was the whole point. I didn't want to deal with crowded trails, loud people, or trash left behind. I just wanted the quiet. I wanted to get away from things for a while. I had the time off work, and I figured it would help clear my head. I'd been stressed lately, and hiking always made me feel better. I packed all the usual stuff. A large backpack with 2 gallons of water, some trail mix, protein bars, dried fruit, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a lighter, a map, compass, my phone with GPS, a power bank, and even a thermal blanket just in case. I also brought my knife and a small can of bear spray. I'd done solo hikes before. I didn't consider myself an expert, but I was careful. I checked the weather the night before, no storms coming, no heat advisories. Everything looked good. The trail was about 8 miles long one way, running deep into the canyon. I had planned to hike in, take a long break at the bottom, then hike back out the same way. The trail wasn't dangerous if you stayed on it. There were steep sections, sure, but nothing too technical. Still, it was isolated, and that added a layer of risk. I parked my car at a small dirt lot around 6:30 a.m. No other cars were there. The trailhead sign was old and faded. It didn't even have a proper map, just a wooden board with a warning about flash floods and a faded description of the canyon ecosystem. I locked up, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The path dipped in and out of shade from tall desert shrubs and rock walls. Lizards darted across the dirt, and I saw a few birds overhead. I didn't see a single other person. That was fine with me. Around mile 4, the canyon narrowed, and the walls rose on both sides. It was beautiful layers of red and brown rock, little streaks of green where moss clung to damp corners. I saw small animal tracks in the dirt. Rabbits, birds, maybe a fox. I kept a steady pace and drank water every 30 minutes. When I reached mile 6, the sun was higher and the temperature was climbing, but I still felt strong. The path turned rocky here, with a few sections where I had to step over boulders or squeeze through tight passes. I slowed down and made sure not to twist my ankle or slip. I took a break, ate a protein bar, and checked my GPS. So far, everything matched the map. I had 2 more miles until the turnaround point. That last stretch was harder. The trail dropped steeply in some spots, and loose gravel made the footing tricky. I stopped again around mile 7 to drink and take a photo. The canyon floor wasn't far now. I was starting to feel the strain in my legs, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. But I wasn't worried. I had plenty of daylight, food, water, and I had marked my waypoints on the GPS. I kept going. When I reached the bottom, it opened up into a flat clearing with a dry creek bed and tall stone walls rising all around. The silence down there was almost unreal. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breathing. I sat down on a flat rock, took off my pack, and rested. I ate more food, drank, and checked my phone. 1 bar of signal, just enough to shoot off a quick text to let someone know I was at the halfway point. I stayed there for about 45 minutes. I stretched, walked around the clearing a bit, took some photos, then decided to head back before it got too hot. I didn't want to be climbing out of the canyon in the afternoon sun. I started hiking back up the way I came. First, it was fine. The trail was steep, but I expected that. I paced myself, took small sips of water, and paused in the shade when I found it. The strange part happened around mile 9, about 1 mile into the return hike. I noticed a spot in the trail that looked different, like something had shifted. I remember stepping over a fallen log on the way down, but now it was gone. I looked around and saw it off to the side of the trail, like someone had dragged it. That made no sense. It was a heavy log. I checked for tracks but saw nothing. I figured maybe I remembered it wrong. I moved on. Another quarter mile and the trail felt unfamiliar. I was sure I was on the same path. I could see the waypoints on my GPS, but something felt off. The trail was thinner. The rocks weren't where I thought they'd be. I stopped and pulled out the map. Everything still lined up, but I had a growing feeling that I was being watched. I shook it off, told myself it was just isolation messing with my mind. I kept walking, trying to match the rhythm of the hike down. I passed a large boulder I had taken a picture of earlier, but now there were fresh scratches on it. Deep gouges, like something sharp had dragged across the surface. They weren't there before. I checked the photo to be sure. They were definitely new. I looked around again. Nothing moved. The canyon was silent. Too silent. Not even the sound of birds anymore. I started walking faster. After about another mile, I checked my GPS again. The line showed I was on the same trail, but it looked like I was slightly off by maybe 30 or 40 feet. I hadn't noticed stepping off the path. I walked back toward the track line and found the trail again, but something about it looked wrong. The ground was softer here, like it had been disturbed. There were boot prints, but not mine. Someone else had been here recently, maybe even today. The prints were heading the same direction as me. That was the moment I started feeling scared. I kept going, moving quicker now. I stopped less. I kept checking over my shoulder. I saw nothing, but I felt something like eyes on me. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't see movement, but I felt it. By mile 11, I noticed more changes. Small things. A branch broken clean off, still green. A pile of stones stacked like a marker, but not one I made. I hadn't seen any trail markers like that on the way down. I started sweating more, not from the heat but from nerves. I pulled out my knife and kept it in my hand. The GPS now showed I was still on course, maybe 10 minutes from the final incline to the trailhead. But then, I saw something that froze me in place. There was a small piece of cloth hanging from a branch, torn and faded, blue like denim. It looked fresh. I hadn't seen it on the way down. When I stepped closer, I saw something worse. A boot print in the dirt, deep and wide, not from a hiking boot. Something heavier, like a work boot. It was big, maybe size 13 or more. My boot next to it looked small. I moved past it and kept going, now almost jogging. The final half mile felt like it lasted forever. My pack bounced against my back, and my legs burned. I kept glancing behind me. At one point, I heard something fall behind me. A rock maybe, but I didn't stop to look. When I finally saw the trailhead sign, I felt a rush of relief. But that didn't last. My car was gone. I stood there in the dirt parking lot, heart racing, looking at the empty space where I had parked. I walked around in a daze, thinking maybe I had parked further down. But no, I recognized the spot. My tire tracks were still there. Panic hit me hard. I pulled out my phone. Still 1 bar of signal. I tried calling 911. The call didn't go through. I texted my location to 2 people. I don't know if it's sent. I sat down behind a large rock and tried to stay calm. I had food, water, shelter if I needed it. But the fact that someone else had been out there, and my car was now gone, that terrified me. I waited there for hours. The sun dropped lower, and the heat faded. I tried the phone again. Nothing. No bars. I thought about walking toward the main road, about 8 miles away, but I didn't want to be caught in the dark out there. I stayed hidden until night fell. Around 10 p.m., I heard something. A truck engine, far off, echoing through the canyon. It got closer. I peeked out from behind the rock. A truck pulled into the lot. A man stepped out. He had a flashlight and started walking toward the trail. I stayed hidden. He looked around, shining the light in every direction. Then he walked back to the truck and drove away. I waited 30 more minutes. Then I started walking. I followed the dirt road by moonlight, using my headlamp when I had to. My legs ached, but I kept going. After a few miles, I saw headlights in the distance. A real road. A state trooper pulled over when he saw me. I told him everything. He called for backup. They searched the canyon the next day but found nothing. No other prints, no signs of my car. Just my tire tracks and some scuffed dirt. They found my car 3 days later, abandoned on a dirt road 15 miles away, stripped of its plates. No fingerprints inside. I never got an answer about who was out there. I haven't hiked alone since. I still think about those boot prints, the moved log, the scratches on the rock. Someone else was in that canyon with me. Someone who knew I was alone. And I think they were following me the whole time. I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in early September. The heat was starting to die down, and I figured it would be a good time to get away from everything. I picked a trail deep in northern Montana, not too far from the Canadian border. It wasn't one of the super popular ones, but it was known to be beautiful and quiet, with long switchbacks that led through thick forest along some ridge lines, and then down into a valley with a stream and a few backcountry campsites. No cell service, no noise, no people. That was the whole point. I parked my car at the trailhead early in the morning, around 6:15. It was cold, but I liked that. I had a 45-liter pack with everything I needed: sleeping bag, small tent, food, water filter, first aid, extra clothes. I double-checked everything before leaving the lot. There were only 2 other cars parked there, and both were dusty, which made me think they'd been sitting for a few days. That gave me a bit of comfort. I wasn't completely alone out there, even if I never saw them. The first part of the trail was pretty steady, mostly uphill but not too bad. It cut through tall pine trees, and everything smelled fresh and damp like the woods always do after a chilly night. My boots crunched over needles and leaves. I walked at a good pace, stopping every hour or so to drink water and check the map. I didn't want to rely just on the paper one, but without GPS or signal, that was all I had. By the time I got to the ridgeline, the sun was fully out, warming everything up. The wind picked up a little, and I could feel it through my sleeves. From that point, I could see down into the valley where I planned to camp. It looked peaceful and untouched, just trees and a thin ribbon of water cutting through. It looked perfect. I started descending the switchbacks on the other side of the ridge. These were tighter, steeper, and covered in loose rock. I had to focus more on where I stepped. Some of the turns had small clearings where you could stop and look out across the valley. The air smelled like sap and dry bark. I started to feel alone in a way I hadn't before. Not scared, not yet, but very aware that I was out there by myself. By mid-afternoon, I reached the valley. I followed the stream upstream a bit, found a flat spot with some natural cover from the wind, and set up my tent. I filtered water, ate some trail mix and a protein bar, and spent the last bit of daylight just walking around the area. It was beautiful, untouched, quiet, the kind of quiet that almost rings in your ears after a while. When it got dark, I got into my sleeping bag and listened to the wind moving through the trees. I heard a few small animals in the distance, maybe squirrels or something bigger moving slowly in the brush. That didn't bother me. I've camped before. I know what sounds normal and what doesn't. That night, everything felt normal. The next morning, I packed up early and planned to continue along the loop trail. It curved around the far side of the valley and would eventually rise back up and connect with the ridgeline trail, taking me back to my car. It was about a 13-mile loop, so I wasn't in any rush. I figured I'd hike halfway through and camp one more night before heading back. About 3 miles in, the trail got narrower. Not just overgrown, but poorly maintained. There were a lot of blowdowns, old dead trees that had fallen across the path, and some of them were hard to climb over. At one point, I had to take my pack off to crawl under a huge fallen log. I started thinking maybe this loop wasn't used as much as the rest of the trail. I hadn't seen any trail markers for a while either. That was the first thing that started to feel wrong. I kept going, thinking I'd hit a clearer section soon. I had a printed map, and it showed the trail continuing east, curving around a small lake before cutting north again. But after another hour of hiking, I didn't see any sign of the lake. The trail started to fade into just a game trail, narrow, uneven, and filled with animal tracks. I stopped and checked the map again. I wasn't sure anymore if I was even on the loop trail. That was when I made the decision that caused everything to go sideways. I decided to keep going forward, thinking the trail would eventually reconnect with the main path. I figured if I backtracked, I'd lose hours, and I didn't want to end up hiking in the dark. So I pushed ahead. The ground got softer. There were patches of mud, and my boots started to sink a little. It felt like I was walking through land that wasn't meant for people. It smelled different, too. Less pine, more like moss and rot. At one point, I found a set of deep hoof prints, too big for a deer. I figured they were from a moose. That didn't worry me much. Moose are huge but usually keep to themselves. The trail disappeared completely around 3 p.m. I kept moving by compass, trying to follow the general direction of where the trail should have gone. It got denser, thicker trees, less light. The sky had that gray tint like it might rain later. I stopped and finally admitted to myself that I was lost. I checked my map, and the only clear landmark nearby was a small creek that ran west to east near the edge of the valley. If I could find that creek, I could follow it upstream and at least know where I was. Water always leads somewhere. I moved slowly now, trying to listen more than walk. I figured if I could hear running water, I could get back on track. That's when I noticed something else. I wasn't hearing anything anymore. No birds, no insects, no wind, just dead silence. That's when the unease set in, deep and low in my chest. I stood still for a long minute trying to hear anything. The forest was holding its breath. I moved slower, trying not to make too much noise with my boots. My shirt was soaked with sweat under my jacket, but the air was cool. Then I smelled something. It was faint but sharp, something like rust and rot together. I followed it slowly, not really thinking clearly at this point. I just felt like I needed to know what it was. And then I found it. A small clearing, maybe 30 feet wide, with thick trees all around. And right in the middle was a dead animal. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a moose calf. Its neck had been broken, twisted completely sideways. Its hind legs were still bent like it had tried to run. The eyes were gone, picked clean by something, but the body hadn't been eaten, just broken and left there. That's not normal. Predators don't do that. I backed away. The smell was stronger now. I looked around and saw broken branches above, about 8 feet off the ground. Whatever took it down was strong and fast. Maybe a bear, but even that didn't make sense. Bears don't usually break necks like that, and they eat what they kill. I turned around and started walking quickly in the opposite direction. Not running, but close. I didn't want to be near that place anymore. I wasn't thinking straight. My stomach was tight. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't stop until I found the creek. I followed it for over an hour, upstream, hoping it would lead me back toward the main trail. My legs were starting to hurt. I hadn't eaten in a while. I stopped and crouched down near the water, refilled my bottle, and took out a granola bar. I tried to calm down. I told myself I was fine, just lost, just overreacting. That's when I saw it. Across the creek, maybe 50 feet away, standing just inside the tree line, was a man. Or at least I thought it was a man. He was tall, too tall. He wasn't wearing any hiking gear, just dark, dirty clothes. His arms were hanging straight down. He didn't move, just stood there, staring. I froze, didn't breathe. I didn't call out. I just stared back. And then he took one step forward. I dropped everything, my bottle, the bar, everything, and ran. I ran upstream, crashing through bushes and over rocks. I didn't look back. I just ran. My chest burned, my knees ached, but I kept going. Eventually, I found a narrow game trail and followed it until it started climbing uphill. I didn't care where it led. I just wanted elevation, distance, anything. By the time the sun started to drop behind the mountains, I found a spot that looked safe enough. A rocky slope with some tree cover. I didn't make camp. I didn't even eat. I just pulled my sleeping bag out and wedged myself into a corner between rocks. where I could see everything around me. I didn't sleep. I just listened. And sometime deep in the night, I heard footsteps below. Not animal footsteps. Boots. Heavy, slow, deliberate steps moving across the forest floor. They stopped for a while, maybe 40 yards downhill. Then silence. I stayed in that spot until dawn. Cold, tired, barely able to think. As soon as it got light, I started moving again. I kept climbing until I hit the top of the ridge. From there, I could finally see where I was, north of where I should have been. I adjusted course and started the long way back. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I barely drank. When I finally got back to the main trail that afternoon, I almost cried. I didn't, but I almost did. It still took another 4 hours to get back to my car. When I got there, both of the other cars were gone. I drove straight to the nearest town, checked into a motel, and didn't sleep again that night. I kept thinking about that